Thank you. My name is Indira Chaudhary, and I'm part of the Center for Public History in Srishti, which is one of the co-organizers of this event. I'm also part of the other co-organizers, and that is the the Association, Oral History Association of India, OHI. And the third organizer who I'd like to thank is the Indian Institute of Human Settlements. And we decided that this was the most appropriate place to host Yumna's talk because she was going to talk about migrant workers in Montreal. For us, Yumna, when you told us what you were going to talk about, what became very, very interesting for most of us who work with oral history is the fact that in your project, you started by interviewing migrant workers who then started, telling themselves their stories. So we are really excited to hear more about those processes. Yumna's talk today is going to be about migrant workers in Montreal. And let me quickly introduce you to her so that we can listen to her fascinating project. Yumna Siddiqui is an associate professor of English at Middlebury College, where she teaches courses on post-colonial literature theory, diaspora and migration studies, and literary theory. She did her PhD in Columbia with Edward Said, and her book, Anxieties of Empire and the Fiction of Intrigue, was published by the Columbia University Press in 2008. And in that book, she looks at the contradictions of post-colonial modernity at the turn of the 19th century and 20th century fiction of detection and espionage. And her current research is on cities, post-colonial migrants, and literature. She volunteers and serves on the board of Immigrant Workers Center in Montreal. So without further ado, let me hand you over to Yumna.
Thank you, Indira. Thank you for coming, and thanks very much to Indira Chaudhary for arranging this, and for Srishti for hosting me, and also to the Oral History Association of India and the Indian Institute of Human Settlements. I should say up front that I'm a lit crit person, and oral history is something that's new to me, and so really this work came out of an engagement with the Immigrant Workers Center, first as a volunteer and also as a board member. And so this was work that was being done at the Immigrant Workers Center. We got a grant for some of the podcasts. I'm going to play a bit of one later. Okay. Also, my talk is rather long, so I might cut it short at the end, but you'll pardon me for reading, since I want to actually contextualize what I'm going to be talking about as well. Okay. Canada has long relied on immigrants to meet its labor needs, and this continues to be the case. Its high levels of immigration have shaped the nation's self-image as an ethnocultural mosaic. The Statistics Canada website declares, quote, Canada is a multicultural society whose ethnocultural makeup has been shaped over time by immigrants and their descendants. What tends to be obscured by this touting of Canada's multiculturalism in government and mainstream public discourse is that the history of immigration to Canada is inseparable from its history of colonization, that is, the dispossession of First Nations people and white settlement. I won't discuss this history of colonization today. Rather, I will focus on the narratives of recent immigrants to Montreal. At the same time, it's important to recognize that new immigrants, in coming to Canada, enter a social space that has been constituted by the genocide of Aboriginal people and white settlement. As Sunera Tobani reminds us, quote, a fundamental principle underpinning the Canadian nation is the ongoing colonization of Aboriginal peoples. As long as Canada remains a white settler colony reproducing colonial relations, the nation will continue to be racialized. The racialized nature of Canadian nation building is clear from a brief overview of the history of immigration to Canada. Canada's foundational narrative is that two groups of Europeans settled Canada, the French and the British, thereby creating a bilingual nation. The French, the story goes, arrived first and between 1604 and 1763 established settlements in Acadia and Quebec. In 1763, after its loss in the 7 Years' War in Europe, France ceded its Canadian territories to Britain. Immigration from France halted and immigrants began to arrive in large numbers from Britain. They were joined after the American War of Independence by British loyalists from North America. In the 19th century, immigration from Britain, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales continued as the west of Canada was settled, and it increased from other parts of Europe, especially during and after World War I. It's also important to note that at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, immigration from Asia increased as Chinese workers found employment building railroads, Sikhs came to work in sawmills, and Japanese immigrants were employed in salmon fisheries. During this period, the country's racist policy of white settlement was made explicit. It introduced restrictions on immigrants from Asia, and from 1876 until the 1960s, the Canadian government distinguished between, quote, preferred and non-preferred races. In the 1960s and 1970s, partly in response to anti-racist and third world liberation movements and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, Canada adopted more liberal immigration policies, moving away from an explicit consideration of race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, gender, and sexuality. These changes were encoded in the Immigration Act of 1976, which established immigration criteria based on family ties, education, skills, work experience, and humanitarian grounds, at the same time introducing a strictly wealth-based investor category. Canada now admits immigrants under three broad categories: economic, family, and refugees. Today, roughly 20% of the Canadian population was born outside Canada. Since the early 1990s, the country has admitted about 250,000 immigrants every year as permanent residents. In the last 40 years, migration from the third world has greatly increased, chiefly from Asia and the Middle East, which constitutes about 60%, but also from the Caribbean, Africa, and Central and South America. Spurred by the economic opportunities Canada touts, as well as because of the neoliberal restructuring of their home economies and greater economic insecurity, also because of heavy national debt and political instability. This demographic shift in immigration to Canada has gone hand in hand with a public embrace of multiculturalism, introduced as an official policy in 1971. Despite the liberalization of immigration policy and this recent infusion of color into a historically white settler colony, Canada is far from being a multicultural utopia for immigrants. As Sunera Thobani shows in her work, the government continues to identify, quote, Canadians as members of the nation and immigrants as a, quote, new problem to be dealt with. In addition to ideological and political forms of marginalization, immigrants face considerable economic disadvantage. Taken as a whole, landed immigrants experience higher rates of unemployment, about twice those of Canadian-born workers. There are also high income gaps between immigrants and Canadian-born citizens, and again, these gaps are pronounced even for highly educated and skilled immigrants. Two scholars, Trifidalopoulos and Tropas, summarize the economic conditions of immigrant labor. Quote, the economic integration of immigrants has worsened of late as regards employment, earning potential, poverty, and social integration. Paradoxically, this has occurred despite Canada's success in attracting the best educated and skilled immigrants in its history. While credentials and experience accumulated abroad assist immigrants in gaining admission to Canada, they are heavily discounted by Canadian employers and professional organizations. As a result, many immigrants have been forced to accept employment far below their qualifications and expectations, end of quote. As other scholars have shown, once immigrants have accepted subpar employment upon first arriving in Canada, they often get stuck in low-wage, precarious jobs. If permanent immigrant workers are marginalized in Canadian society and the Canadian economy, this is even more emphatically the case for temporary immigrant workers. Under its Temporary Foreign Workers Program, created in 2002, Canada accepts so-called unskilled and skilled foreign workers on a temporary basis for jobs that employers must show have not been filled by Canadians. In some cases, for example, those of live-in caregivers, temporary work has offered the prospect of permanent status after 2 years of work with the same employer. Presently, the government is in the process of tightening regulations on temporary foreign workers. So one instance of this is the creation of two categories, skilled and unskilled workers, and workers in the latter category have no path to permanent residence, and their work permits are tied to their employer. Time restrictions have also increased for unskilled TFWs, who are only given permits for a maximum of 4 years and then have to return to their home countries for 4 years before they can apply again. Critics argue that the TFW program creates an extreme form of flexible labor, channeling low-skilled workers into low-paying jobs in construction, service, and manufacturing, where they suffer human rights abuses and exploitation. It is worth noting that the TFW program is actually being expanded by Stephen Harper's Conservative government. Canada admitted more temporary migrants than permanent residents for the first time in 2006, and this has been the case ever since, creating a permanently temporary migrant labor force.
This is a demonstration of Wirecast.
It is in this context of immigrants' economic and social marginalization and disadvantage that the Immigrant Workers Center was set up in Montreal in 2000 by a small group of Filipino-Canadian union organizers and their allies. While it continues to get support from unions and two board members are union employees, the center operates independently so as to avoid bureaucratic rigidity and because it aims specifically to serve immigrant workers' needs. And this is the main website for the IWC. You can read more about it on its website. Run by volunteers and 2 staff members, the center addresses the injustices faced by immigrant workers in Montreal by working on individual cases, organizing campaigns, engaging in public education and training, and functioning as a community space for immigrants. Over the years, the IWC has worked on a number of issues and campaigns related to workers' compensation, labor standards, health and safety, and precarity, all of which have originated in workers' individual cases. In 2011 and 2012, I and another volunteer, David Koch, interviewed 15 workers who were connected to the IWC about their lives. My aim was to document and analyze their stories, exploring how they made narrative sense of their journeys to Canada and their experiences of work and life in Montreal. Associates and members of the IWC had earlier done interviews with workers and published a book in 2009 about workers' experiences and in the context of organizing in a neoliberal climate in Canada. In this book, Fight Back, Workplace Justice for Immigrants by Chowdhury et al., scholars discuss in detail the role of neoliberal policy and trade agreements in creating economic conditions that spur the movement of migrant workers from the global south to the north in general, and Canada in particular. They glean from about 50 interviews workers' common experience of what they call, quote, learning in reverse, that is, learning to live and work in degrading conditions demanded of them by the Canadian labor market and Canadian employers. They write, quote, the context of migration and that of the local service economy in which most immigrants labor, with its subcontracting, precarious work, low pay, and lack of power for workers, structure the daily lives of new immigrants. The category of immigrant worker is formed by the relations learned in the workplace. Arbitrary power relations, lack of stability, poverty, long hours, and lack of respect and the impossibility of returning home. In other words, the options are limited and pre-structured for them. End of quote. So for many, learning to be an immigrant worker means negating their skills, credentials, experiences, hopes and beliefs, and reworking their sense of self. At the same time, Chaudhry et al. Argue, some workers engage in what they call transgressive learning, demanding respect and taking action against workplace injustice. Broadly speaking, the stories of the immigrant workers I interviewed confirmed the findings of Chaudhry and his colleagues. They spoke of their frustration at having their skills, credentials, and experience devalued, of workplace injustice, and of the alienating conditions of their labor, and also of their social isolation. They also made it clear that they were ready to, quote, fight back in a number of different ways, and that they were more conscious of their rights and their just dues as workers at present than when they arrived. So in my project, what I want to do is look more closely at a few stories and try to elucidate the way immigrant workers make narrative sense of their experience and also the tensions and contradictions that they articulate in their narratives. At the time that David and I did interviews, two new campaigns were emerging at the IWC. One that focused on challenges faced by temporary agency workers and another that focused on temporary foreign workers. Another ongoing campaign at the IWC was with PNI, the Filipino Women's Organization of Montreal, to obtain CSST coverage, that is, health and safety regulations and compensation for live-in caregivers. Joey Kalugai, a staff worker and community organizer at the IWC, put us in touch with some of the workers whom he knew, and we knew some of them, through these campaigns. I compensated each individual for his or her time with an honorarium of $50 from research funds. We assured the interviewees anonymity, and so I'm going to make up names. In all of the interviews, we asked interviewees about their departures from their home countries, their migration to Canada, and their experience of work and everyday life in Canada. We tried to avoid a question and answer format and to take our cue from the accounts of the workers, sometimes asking them to expand on or clarify things that they said. I will discuss the stories of different kinds of workers I interviewed. So first, live-in caregivers, then temporary foreign workers, and finally temporary agency workers. And for lack of time, I'm just going to concentrate on one interview with each. So first, temporary agency workers. In 1981, a foreign domestic workers program was established by the Canadian government to meet Canadians' needs for carers for children and elderly people. This morphed in 1992 into the live-in caregiver program with a live-in requirement. Now, 90% of the people employed through the LCP are Filipina women. All three of the caregivers I interviewed were Filipina. We were put in touch with them by Joey, who is a staff member, as I said, and who is himself Filipino and has contacts with PNI. The first person we interviewed, whom I will call Mary, was especially warm, inviting us to meet her at her apartment, an apartment she shared with her friend. We started, as we did all the interviews, by asking her to tell us about her life before she came to Canada, what she did, where she lived, and why she decided to come. She began by telling us, and I'm actually just going to read the interviews and try to stay as close to the words that they used. Yeah, actually, before I came here, I come from Hong Kong. I am also a domestic helper there for 12 years. And I have 2 kids already, and I'm a single mom. She elaborated that her kids were in the Philippines with her mother. Quote, "It's so dramatic story. And I decided to come here because, I'm separated with my husband, so I'm sorry." At this point, she began to cry and we stopped, unsure how to proceed. She continued, quote, "It's so hard for me, but I'm still trying, still working because of my kids. And being immigrant workers, it's so hard because, you're always away with your family. And my kids are growing without mother like me." End of quote. At first it had seemed that she was anguished by her separation, but it now appeared that what was more difficult, her separation from her husband, but what now appeared was that she was more upset about her separation from her family, or perhaps the motherless situation of her children. But in any case, what was clear is that she identified herself as an immigrant worker, and to be an immigrant worker was to be separated from one's family. She recounted how she had had 4 jobs in Hong Kong with very good employers. One, she said, was a family who had taken her with them to China, but when she told them she didn't know the language and was lonely, had then helped her to find another job in Hong Kong. Several things emerged from her story: that she was very experienced, that she clearly articulated in general terms the difficulties of domestic work, and that she had been able to find decent employment. These are her words again, quote, "So being a domestic worker, even it's so hard, you know, we can survive and can stay with the foreign employers, you know, even you can experience something that the employer maltreat you, and they don't treat you like a human being, you know. It's something like that. They treat you like a slave or something like that. They give you food, but it's just little, you know. It's not same with them. You cannot eat the same food from them. And you can work the hours that no limit. You can work as long as they need you, you know. Even you can sleep in the late night or early in the morning. So when I was in Hong Kong, I have a very good experience with my bosses," end of quote. Mary described the difficulties that many domestic workers faced, identifying herself as a member of the profession and speaking for it. At the same time, her phrase, "something like that," which she used several times, suggested that these were not difficulties that she had consistently experienced. So we wondered why she had come to Canada. She had decided to come to Canada, she explained, quote, "because I was always thinking about my kids' future, because even you work in Hong Kong for 20 years, 50 years, you cannot receive, like here, the citizenship. Yeah. Unless you get married, Hong Kong people, you know, something like that. Yeah, but here, because I have so many friends already that they become citizen already and the family bring here." End of quote. This was the rationale we heard from most of the temporary foreign workers that we interviewed, the hope that they would be able to bring their family to Canada, and it is clearly what makes the program appealing. Mary spoke freely about her experience before coming to Canada, but when her story turned to her experience in Canada, she said, quote, "So I come here and then I work with my boss in 2 months and then I experienced a bad experience from them, you know. And this time, you know, actually I don't always to share it because it's, you know, this time we are in court." End of quote. Uncertain how to proceed and not wanting to ask her about something she didn't want to talk about, I asked, "So how long have you been in Canada?" Mary said, quote, "It's almost 2 years. This September, I'm 2 years here. And then on the 2nd month, I worked with my boss. It's so hard for me, so I talked to my agency that I want to quit to my job. And they said, no, you cannot quit. You can stay with them. They are good." End of quote. The Live-In Caregiver program requires participants to work for 24 months with the same family and then gives them the opportunity to apply for permanent residence. If she had stayed in the job, I knew she would be close to that point. She continued, quote, "I said, it's so hard for me because when I arrived 2 weeks before, the couple separated. So I worked in 2 houses. Yeah, so every time when the kids was on the father's side, I need to go with the kids. And then if the kids go to the mother, so I stay with the mother, you know?" End of quote. This predicament of shuttling between households, that of being not only a migrant but completely transferable, was one that the next live-in caregiver I interviewed also described. Mary described the experience of not only being on call all the time, but of having to shuttle from household to household. She circled back to the dramatic experience that she didn't want to talk about, quote, "But it's so dramatic, but I feel sad, you know, because every time when I recall my bad experience here, you know, sometimes I decided to go home, you know. But if I'm thinking about go home, I cannot go home because I have 2 kids, you know." End of quote. Again, worried that I had pushed her to talk about something she wanted to avoid, I asked her about her children and her day-to-day life in the Philippines. She described this and spoke once again about working in Hong Kong and then about the logistics and the hazards of getting a job in Canada. This is a quotation. No, if you've paid them, this is about the agencies. No, if you've paid them, they give you already an employer. So when you arrive here, you directly go to, But sometimes I hear that there is some, like a fake agency, that on the airport, when the immigration officer asks where your employer lives, and they want to talk to your employer first before you enter, they don't have employer, So sometimes they called it airport to airport. You come here from the other country, but you can only stay in the airport. You cannot exit. You cannot go in because they screen you so much, and they are very strict. Yeah, it happens to many Filipina too. They pay too much money, and then when they arrive in Canada, airport, no more. The employer and the agency is gone. End of quote. Mary was now speaking not only about her own experience, but of a shared knowledge of Filipina workers in general. As one would expect, she was well aware of what she might come up against, though it was not clear to me whether she had learned this subsequently after living in Canada or knew of these hazards before. She also, at this point, raised something that came up in interviews with temporary agency workers, the shadowy character of agencies, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So it was clear that Mary was both reluctant and keen to talk about what had happened to her in Canada. She had already used the word dramatic 3 times to describe it. And yet I wasn't sure whether to broach the question again. We circled back to her first job again, and again I tried to skip forward. I said, "You left that job then?" She said, "Oh, yeah, because, I leave that job because, when she's accusing me like a thief. So now we're fighting on the court, That's why I know. That's why I know Pinay, because when I'm in on the court for the first time, so I go there by my own, and on that time, my boss accused me. We are on the husband place, and then it's my day off. When I arrive in my husband's house, I'm surprised, because the wife went there early in the morning. But I'm thinking, why is she here? She never came there and visit the husband's house, And then when I arrived there in the morning, I'm saying, good morning, everybody. And I feel like, oh, everybody is like very cold, So I'm thinking, oh, something wrong. And then later on, the husband told me, when I've tidied up his room, he said, "Oh, Em, come here, because my wife is here. She's looking for something." I said, "What?" "It's my day off yesterday, and then now you're asking something." And then the wife said, "Oh, I lost my jewelries and everything, something." And then I said, "What? Are you serious?" And then, she said, "Okay, Mary, get your key. Only your key in your apartment, and we will go there for searching." So it's like, my God, I'm only 2 months here. I don't know everything, And then I'm like stupid, following what she wants, And then I never bring my phone, my bag, because she said, "You cannot bring anything, only the key of the apartment, But the police told me that supposedly I cannot open the apartment because I'm not the owner of the house." But I said, "Of course, I'm in shock. I'm only following what they want, And then, the husband and the wife go together, and then they raid my room. Yeah, and they make all my stuff mess, Yeah, and searching. And she don't search anything, but the one she searched is mine. So I phoned to my landlady. I interjected, "Did you call the police?" Mary, "No, she done call the police. And even me, I don't call the police because I don't know. I don't know everything here. So when the husband and wife taking something, checking everything, and my room is so mess, And then I phoned to the owner of the house, and then I said, "Oh, please, can you come here because your house is getting so terrible, And then she arrived quickly, and then she said, "Oh, what's happening, Mary?" "No, my boss accused me that I'm taking the jewelry," something like that. And then she's looking for my stuff. And then, and I have jewelries because I don't send it to Philippines. I bring all my stuff here because I'm thinking I will not go home anymore. Probably I will stay here. So I bring everything here, and then I have one small bag, when you're in the airport, I said, "Security," David, "carry on," Mary, the small bag, and there's a lock of it. So I lock it, and I put all my important stuff. And he opened, the husband opened it by something, And then when I saw the wife taking all my jewelries, I said, hey, excuse me, that's mine. That's mine. And then the woman told me, oh, yeah, I know this is yours, but now it's mine. Yeah, so you know? And then every time I grabbed from her, I said, hey, excuse me, that's mine, you know? And then she'd say, hey, you better shut up. You go there and stand there. Don't come up here, okay? So I'm like stupid. I'm stand up there close to the door and doing nothing, watching them, you know. It seems like, oh my God, I'm like, you know, I have the right. And I said, you didn't know what to do. Yeah, and you know, my boss phoned my agency and then my agent came and you know, my agency, she's screaming at me. And she said, hey, Mary, what's wrong with you? Why did you do this? You know, and you're the only one, you're the only nanny that I hired that you make like this trouble. Okay, I'm going to sort of cut this off at this point. At this point, Mary was so animated that we were enthralled that we were, and we were so enthralled that we were trying to help her tell the story. She went on to recount how she had spent a night in a police cell, how she had been kicked out by her landlady who didn't want, quote, police trouble, and how she had been helped by a newly made friend. Looking back at this interview, a number of things strike me. One is that Mary herself was looking back at a moment of extreme humiliation and trauma, and was recounting it with outrage. Whereas earlier she had spoken with a certain sense of distance in the past tense, she now switched into reported speech and sometimes into the present tense. It was as if she was reliving the episode. It was also clear that she had told the story many times because she referred to the confusion of her lawyer. What's also striking is that she repeatedly expressed disbelief at her own naivete and passivity. She said more than once, so I'm like stupid. She clearly had a present sense of agency, something she had not had or not exercised earlier. Also, I was struck by my own stupidity. I asked her if she had called the police when her belongings were taken by her employer, and later whether she had filed a case against her employer, not grasping her own sense of vulnerability vis-a-vis the state. As it turned out, she was helped by the state indirectly. The police officer who locked her up told her she could get free legal aid and she got a lawyer. At the court, she was assigned an interpreter who was familiar with the Filipina organization PINAI, and from then she had help at every point. When I interviewed her, she had a live-out job and was waiting for her case to be decided. The second live-in caregiver I interviewed was a nurse. I'll call her Brenda, who was working as a nanny. She worked with an American family and spoke of frequent challenge of being parceled out among family members. The word that she used again and again in her interviews was frustrated. She's used the word frustrated or frustrating 7 times. She was frustrated because she had been waiting 15 months after applying for permanent residence and had heard nothing, because she had left an interesting, well-paid job as a pediatric nurse at a hospital in Saudi Arabia where her skills were valued, because she was now working as a domestic worker rather than as a nurse, because she couldn't study while on an LCP permit as she wanted to. She said, quote, so I really miss my life in Saudi Arabia because, you know, there we have these like, how should I say, we have this pediatric club because in a hospital you really have all the professionals work as a team. So it's like a get-together for all the team, the doctors, the nurses, and all the food is free. I mean, there's like a drug company that will sponsor that, so it's like a really big party, and you know, everything is free. End of quote. Like Mary, she had come thinking she would have a path to permanent residence and eventually to being a nurse in Canada. Now she regretted having come. At the same time, she spoke highly of PINAI and also talked about a political organization that she had formed to put political pressure on her own government in the Philippines to stop corruption and violence in her hometown. And she was quite clear about her limited opportunities in the Philippines, where presently 200,000 nurses are unemployed. Okay, so those were just 2 of the interviews I did with with live-in caregivers. I also interviewed a number of temporary foreign workers. And I'm here going to focus on the interview of one of them, Luke. I I interviewed 3 other machinists from the Philippines. He was a machinist from the Philippines. And so this is a little bit about them. So 3 of the 4 machinists I interviewed had families, and they said explicitly that they had left the Philippines to seek a better future for their children. Whereas the Filipino caregivers had a path to permanent residence, the temporary foreign workers, even though they were in the skilled classes, were in limbo, uncertain whether they would be able to meet the residency and language requirements to immigrate. So in Luke's story, what one gets a clear sense of is his earlier experience of political organizing and how that served him in Canada. Again, Joey, who speaks Tagalog, set up the interview, and this time he was actually present at the interview. Luke began his story this way. Before I came here in Canada, so I work in automotive industry in the Philippines, in southern Tagalog. So my life is a simple life, you know. I have my wife now with 2 kids. So when I started 1995, so 1995. So I'm only 20 years old, so I start my work. So it's OJT, on-the-job training. So as a single man, you're always thinking that your only work in your life as a single. But later on, so because of the other basic needs and necessities, so our salary, so it's not, in the Philippines, we have a cheap salary, ongoing right now. So we started to, because when I entered in the company in the Philippines, they have a traditional union. So they have company union. So since 1991, so I started to involve in the union activities since 1997, because in the Philippines, the union have, what do you call this? The term, the 5 years term. So 90, 91, 96. So there's some workers to form a genuine union to fight the traditional union, because this union is the company union. It's not provide the true wages, the right wages, the benefits and the protection of the welfare of the workers. So there's some workers like to form a union after the 5 years grace period. So I involved in that. So I involved in that to form another union. So we wait the grace period, 5 years, to conduct a certificate election. In the Philippines, you need to conduct a certificate election. There's a 2 union involved, so there's 2 choices in the ballot box. If ununionized company, so it's only yes or no. So we form a union secretly, because in the Philippines, if you form a union, a genuine union, not the company, it's genuine, it means workers' union. So, and not manipulated by the other people, the other political or other person. So it's very hard to form a union in the Philippines, because there are a lot of legal ways. Although it declares in our labor code in the Philippines, it's your right, it's only to form a sign, to sign the workers' sign. I think only 20% of so if you form a union, to register a union to be a legal entity. Then after that, the labor must conduct a certificate election. We are in the labor code, but in practical, it's not happened like that, because there are legal ways. As I said, the company, they have right to protest. They have right to union consolidation. So the company is not to obligate to, not to obligate to accept, yes, to recognize the union. Because this is the real union, the genuine union. But if it's a company union or the traditional union, it's automatically, because in the labor code of the Philippines, we have a voluntary, acceptance. So even they have no election, the company, they accept the decision. They conduct a collective bargaining agreement. That's why we did that secretly. So we did education, so workers' education. We done this after our work, after a shift. If your afternoon shift, we did morning. And during Sunday, because in the Philippines, you're Monday to Saturday, so your only rest day is in the Sunday. We did this, we planned to conduct education. So we have education, how to form a union and how to conduct a collective bargaining agreement. So officers and the members, so we've done this smoothly. So because the management, there's another form a union, but we already registered. And we in the labor agency, they need to, release or order to conduct a certificate election. So we win. We win at the election, but the company, again, they didn't recognize us. We are the sole collective bargaining agent. So they have protest again. In the Philippines, the judiciary system, it's from Department of Labor. They go to the Court of Philippines, they appeal that this union is not, or they make a publication. Publication cases like, they use, for example, the signatures of the workers, they said, David, they said the signatures you collected were fake? Yeah. And the other groups, so they make signature of the workers. Okay, and so he continues, and describes how, in fact, they were able to form a legitimate labor organization. It was clear from his first words that Luke had extensive experience at organizing on the shop floor, and he spoke with pride of the challenging formation of the union. This was the story that he wanted to tell. He was also proud of what the genuine union had achieved: much higher raises, a rice subsidy, a meal allowance, and a transport allowance. He was also well aware of the larger economic and political context, which he explained to us. Quote, "When I went in the Philippines, so aside from the union in the company or inside the plant, we only joined to the mass movement of the other sectors, like the peasant, like the students. So because we see this, because the roots of the problem, it's not when you're in the company and formed a CBA unit and CBA the problem is solved. But we see like this, it's not solving to form a union. It's not solving the root of the cause of the high commodities or living. So we see this as the old system of the Philippines. That's why our union, the company, we joined to the mass movement to seek to the government to implement, or implement to make a plan for the genuine industrialization in the Philippines. Because in the Philippines there are a lot of foreign investor, only invest because of the cheap labor policy of the government. And the industrial zone implement a no union, no strike policy." Luke spoke of the need to articulate labor organizing with other mass movements in the face of government neoliberal policies. Ultimately, he said he decided to leave again for the sake of his families. However, he spoke not of his sadness at leaving his family or his home, but of his comrades. And here Joey translated for us from Tagalog. So I asked, why did you decide to leave? You explained a bit, but what were your feelings and how did you find out about the opportunity to come to Canada as a temporary foreign worker? This is Joey's translation. He's saying that the opportunities for himself and his family were limited. So even though they win some gains, get some gains, it's never enough. He's saying it was a very sad day. He had to explain to his comrades, his workmates, that, he has to leave. It's like everybody, he's sort of forced to seek other opportunities and work abroad. But he said it's important for them to continue what they started, because none of this is going to change until the whole system is somehow overturned and changed. What was most striking about Luke's story was his strong commitment to organizing and his sense of regret at having left his comrades. Okay. So he came to the Philippines, and we then asked him about his conditions of work in Quebec, and he described them to us. He and another Filipino worker were employed to run the machines in the night shift, operating 2 machines instead of 1 at a time. They were paid $14 an hour as opposed to $17. So they were clearly both being paid less as well as doing work that Quebecois workers were not willing to do. Anyway, this is what he says about what his hopes were. The expectation in Canada. So I become permanent resident here. That's my ambition or aim right now, to become a permanent resident here. So it's very hard to work as a temporary. So you have a contract any moment. So if the company, they want to renew your contract, it's very difficult if you're only temporary. So like me, I'm a unionist in the Philippines. So if I have a chance to permanent here, I want to form a union here in Canada. So I want to continue. Yes, I want to continue because working in the union, it's good. So to help other people, to protect their rights, it's very successful. Important too, of course, to protect your own and to protect other people and to fight for your rights, of course. Okay, so what we see in his interview is a strong sense of his past career as a union worker and organizer, and his sense that he was going to carry forward the work he had done there. And I mean, ultimately, he was obviously very strong and had a lot of initiative and found a path to permanent residence by moving to another province under a provincial nominee program. So when I interviewed him, he was about to leave. The other three machinists were uncertain about their prospects, and at the time that I interviewed them, they wanted these clarified by the company. But in the meantime, they too had negotiated something. They had negotiated lower rent and a pay raise. So they were more satisfied in general than the caregivers I interviewed, paradoxically, because even though in a sense what they wanted was to remain as permanent residents and had no obvious path to that, they had a much stronger sense of their value as workers and their ability to negotiate and to move in their jobs. Okay. Because I've taken quite a long time, I'm not going to read about the third category of interviews that we did, but I'll just talk about them. We also interviewed a group of temporary agency workers, and essentially a campaign started around temporary agency workers because so many had come to the center, and many of them had come from a particular employer, Dollarama, a dollar store, where they had been shifting boxes. So, in fact, two of the people I interviewed had worked for Dollarama, and then one of the people whose interview I've written up for this talk had worked at many different jobs. And their predicament, again, I mean, some of them were non-status workers, some of them had permanent residence. But what was striking here was that all of them had started out as sort of middle class. One of them had been the manager of a factory in Pueblo in Mexico and said he had left because of the sort of drug-related violence there. He had come with his wife and his daughter to Canada. Another, when I asked him about his experience traveling, said he had traveled a lot as a child because his mother was an air hostess. So traveling was no big deal, but coming to Montreal and dealing with the cold and the snow was much harder. And then a third had been an engineer in Senegal and had also ended up working for Dollarama and had, they all talked about the sort of extremely difficult conditions of their work. So just a few words then about what they say about working for temporary agencies in Montreal. Okay, so this is about safety conditions. And I'll talk about the person who came from Pueblo, Mexico. This is what he said. Quote, well, the degree of safety that I've had is basically nil. He described, quote, clearing snow at a height of 3 meters on slippery, icy roofs without safety equipment, cleats, cords, harnesses for the temporary workers. At the same time, at the other end, that is, so these workers who were employed through agencies were working side by side by permanent employees who were, quote, insured, who worked directly for the company, who were provided with helmets, cleats, harnesses, special tools, and special clothing for the cold. And meanwhile, all we had was rubber boots. Ricardo left that job, but as he said, one of my buddies fell, fractured his clavicle, and was incapacitated for 2-3 months. Ricardo also experienced a serious workplace injury. Quote, the injury that I had was caused by a fall on a production line on a conveyor belt. We didn't have access to the controls for the machines, so people had accustomed themselves to jumping the belt. There was no other way because shutting down the machine would slow things down and cause problems with production. One of the security railings was loose. I fell on my head and remained unconscious for a few minutes, and then I don't remember. After what happened, there was no ambulance called. They sent me to the cafeteria. I was in a state of shock, and they continued with the production, which for them was the most important thing. And as he said, I'm still dealing with some gaps, holes in my memory, even to date. And then he described another accident that a fellow worker experienced, but as much as, he then talked also about the actual stress that this kind of work caused. He said, it starts to produce a lot of stress in your body, and besides that, physically you have to be constantly alert and focused on what you're doing. For example, they set you to work in places where normally the machine should be able to function on its own, but nobody had calibrated it because they didn't bother to contract a technician to do it. So it's controlled with a kind of laser beam in order to keep the size of the loaves of bread standard. But we had to do it manually. So you're watching these laser beams constantly for an 8-hour shift. Some people ended up dizzy or vomiting. So really, you come out of that totally physically drained. Even as draining as the physical stress was the constant psychological pressure that supervisors put on workers. Ricardo described this pressure, quote, they were constantly threatening to fire us. The state of being constantly threatened with dismissal sets off a kind of super stress. That can end up also creating psychological problems. I lived through that, and well, it's pretty tough. It leaves a mark on you. And the problems then can get transferred through a person to their family, to their wife, their children, neuroses, and a person feels a kind of incompetence towards all kinds of things. Their job, being in that kind of situation, constantly blocks the kind of consciousness that you need to get out of the vicious cycle. And having a low wage puts you in a situation where, say, you can't handle having a whole week without work. And as a result, you can't leave your job. On a psychological level, that's really hard to deal with. End of quote. Okay, so then he described his work and the conditions of work. I think of the people I interviewed, he was the most eloquent in actually describing the conditions of work. Eventually, because of his injury, he was directed to the Immigrant Workers Center, who then helped him. They provided him with a translator, with lawyers, essentially volunteers at the university, helped him to file his demands. So, when we met him, and I will say this, I met all of these workers in the context of campaigns. He was part of a campaign to organize temporary agency workers, and things were looking slightly better for him. This is what he says about his situation. He says, there are gaps in the law through which all kinds of agencies can grow and thrive. This is a problem that affects the government itself because these companies aren't paying taxes, but also because it damages the image of investment, damages the image of the government. They have to focus their attention on these gaps in the law so that it's harder for agencies to dodge the law and leave people in situations like this. They should specify exactly who holds the responsibility for paying medical insurance and taking care of workplace safety. Is it the agency or the company that hires the agency? It needs to be spelled out clearly so that workers can protect their rights. So he had, along with other people in this campaign that formed around temporary agency workers, come out with a clear platform and a program. So part of the experience of immigrant workers is also that of organizing and articulating their needs. Okay, so in conclusion, I want to pull some of these, the threads of these interviews together, and then talk just very briefly and play a clip of an interview that one of the workers did with another worker. One thing that was striking was that many of the workers whom we interviewed were extremely worldly and cosmopolitan, having worked not only in their home countries, but as migrant workers in other countries. One might call this a kind of working cosmopolitanism. They were also conversant with general narratives of overseas workers, good and bad. So many of them sort of talked about stories they had heard about, about rape, about violence, and this had put them on guard. They they didn't actually necessarily want to embrace this, life of an, as they put it, overseas worker. But at the same time, they had networks of family and friends with whom they had shared knowledge and experience. They came to Canada somewhat unprepared for the adverse conditions of work that they experienced and the difficult situations that they found themselves in. And they were constrained in their ability to mobilize and protest because of their precarious situations. They voiced despair and frustration, but at the same time, a strong sense of agency when I interviewed them. They put up with adverse situations because of clear goals, often to bring their families to Canada. At the same time, they were conscious of their rights and took action against workplace injustices, connecting with organizations such as the IWC and PNAI. In some cases, they brought with them their experiences of negotiating and organizing, which they were ready to draw on in Canada. Okay, so we did this project, and then my collaborator, David, who is not an academic and was doing a master's in communications and was interested in radio production, really felt strongly that this was a sort of, an academic project that had no benefit for the workers. So at his instigation, the project took on another dimension. He arranged to produce radio programs and podcasts based on our interviews. And some of the people we had interviewed used our transcripts to do short interviews of each other. Okay, so I'm going to just quickly show you where these are. Oh, okay, one second, sorry. Okay. So this, if you follow the links to projects, there's a link to Migrant Voices. And so I think there are 5 interviews on the website that we did, and we were very pleased because not only then could workers listen to each other, but a lot of people got hits. The sites got a lot of hits from other people, hundreds. Okay, so my original aim had been to document the experience of workers and place them on historical record to provide a critical counterpoint to neoliberal and mainstream narratives of migration and present the perspectives of immigrant workers on their circumstances and to analyze the stories that immigrant workers shared, exploring how they made narrative sense of their experiences. But with the podcasts, the workers moved the project into the realm of actually, being involved in engaging in a kind of archiving of public history, being involved in public history themselves and archiving their experience. First of all, they gained experience in using audio technology. They created records of their stories, and then they were able to share these stories with each other and the world. So I'm just going to play a clip from one of these stories, which I think is interesting because this was the story of Mary, and I'm going to pick it up where she talks about what happened to her, about being accused of theft. And when she talked to us, she was very, very animated and agitated, but you can tell me what you think her tone is and how she presents the story in a kind of public way. Okay.
About what happened to your first employer, they accused you of theft. You actually had to spend a night in jail. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, actually it's a big surprise and it's a bad experience, that I don't know what's wrong with my boss. I don't understand why suddenly she accused me like, I'm lost something and I want to search your apartment, But because I'm newly here in Canada, so I don't know what I'm going to do. So it seems like I'm always, I'm always following what they want, So it's so hard for me,
You fight in court about this charge.
Yeah, I fight for that when I found, somebody to help me, like the PNAI organization, But on the first time that I'm accused, it seems like I'm always thinking that, this is the end of my, that's the end of the world for me. Because I'm thinking, why I came here in Canada and it happened for me like this, you know, to have a bad experience like this.
Mhm. And the decision was on your side. They found that it's not true what the.
No, actually, I cannot say it's not true because it's still going on the
okay.
court. So I need to go back there for you know, continue the court case, fighting for that.
And your employer actually entered your private apartment and searched through your belongings. Could you describe what they did and what they said about?
Yeah, actually,
Yes,
they
too.
are the one who brought me there on my apartment, and then they said they want to search my place. So maybe the stupid thing is I brought them and I allowed them to go into my apartment, although I don't have the rights to do that because it's not my own place, you know. I'm only renting. So it seems like I don't have permission to my landlady. So, but the sad thing is they search everything, and you know the whole house is like miserable. You know, they don't respect anybody there. Yeah.
And you were at the police station later and you spent the night in jail cell. Could you describe this
Oh
experience?
yeah, that's the worst thing, and I can't forget it. You know, it seems like it's a big trauma for me because every time now I saw the police car patrol and everything, I'm so scared. You know, it seems like I'm shaking. You know, because it's always flashing to my mind that one time it happened to me that I ride on that car. You know, and I sleep in the room that it seems like only a chair, and in your front you can see the toilet bowl, you know, and you can hear something that screaming they want to get off from the cell, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking like, oh my God, what might gonna happen to me in here, you know. And I always crying, you know. I'm thinking about better for me to go home, you know.
Yeah.
It's so sad, you know.
You mentioned before that your employer actually went to your apartment and you said that you're just renting. So what's the reaction of your landlady about this?
Actually, you know, that's normal that they are on shock, you know. Like, of course, I know they feel bad for me, and of course, maybe they will angry because thus it becomes like terrible, you know.
But when you returned from the jail, did your landlady still welcome you? I mean,
No, of course.
let you stay
No,
in the
no, no, no,
apartment?
no. They don't allow me to go in there again because they said, oh, you cannot come in anymore in my place because we are under like, you know, police surveillance, something
Oh,
like that.
okay.
You know, they are monitored. So I said, oh, it's fine. And one of my good friends, she recommended me to stay in another place, you know. So
Okay, I'm going to stop there. So you can see that this is a very, very different version of the same story. First of all, it's being told collaboratively. I wonder if it was a good idea. I mean, every time, you know, one does oral history, the conditions that one does it in change, of course, what it is that the narrative that comes of it. So she was obviously working very closely from my script, but the person who was doing the interviewing had a very clear sense of what she wanted told. She already knew the story clearly and was sort of leading her through the story. What strikes me now about Mary's account of it is that, especially when she began, she was very cool and collected and authoritative, as opposed to being sort of agitated and shocked and outraged. This was her public voice. This was the voice that she wanted to project as somebody who was sharing a story to a larger audience. And then you can see that her voice shifts right at the end when she starts talking about, when she sees a police car, what it does to her. It becomes animated again. I mean, she has a very sort of, vivid way of speaking. But I thought it was very interesting to see the shift in tones and the kind of authority and the kind of energy that she used in the different kinds of interviews. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I've been talking for an hour. Yeah.
Will you? Thank you so much, Yumna, because I thought, actually, when you played that to us and you actually contextualized, your own interview and read out the transcription, it gave a different sense of, how she told the story. And in this, she seems so much more in control, and she says it with greater control, and she doesn't want it to be, she doesn't want to let her emotions run away with the story. So I'm wondering if part of it is because the person interviewing her has read your script and therefore knows it and directs it in a certain way, but it's also her public voice, as you say.
Yeah.
And
of course, the third thing is that, I was worried that she may not want to rehearse the story publicly since the case was already, was going on at that time.
So maybe she wanted it to, just to pass over it rather than...
Yeah, maybe. It was hard to say.
Yeah.
But the end result is that you have a kind of collaborative account that's much more sort of authoritative in a way, much cooler in a way.
Yeah. But before I'll hand the mic over in a moment, I just had a question which was more to do with the immigrant sense of the city. How do they perceive the city? What kind of understanding of urban life they bring with them? Because, Heather Goodall, who has often visited us, has talked about the experience of immigrants in Sydney when they go fishing, or the use of the river. So the Vietnamese use it in a certain way, the Arabs do other things. So she was just observing that, their ideas that are shaped from their experience back home still take other forms when they have come into this new space. So I'm wondering, in your work with this, with the migrant workers, whether you had any observations to share about their sense of urban life in Montreal.
No, I'm actually now working on the city and fiction, and I wish I could go back. And I think one of my aims is to actually go back and interview them again to see where they are in their lives 3 or 4 years down the road, but also to flesh out their experience of urban life. I would say that what one did get a very strong sense of was that, especially with live-in caregivers, when their lives were very different, if their experience of the city was of living at home in their workplace as a live-in caregiver, where they had very little control over their time, didn't have their own space. And what Mary spoke about was how happy she was with her present employer, and because she lives out and shares an apartment with somebody else, she invited us, into the apartment. And so we had a strong sense of the fact that she now had an independent life in the city. She didn't speak that much about her experience of the city at large, but she spoke a lot about her experience of Pinay, the organization of Filipina women that she was associated with, and how she regularly goes to events organized by them. So I think, at least for certain communities of immigrants, there is a kind of at least a kind of mass or a critical mass and enough of a center around community organizations for community life to work around those organizations. And then the other people I interviewed, were living about an hour from Montreal itself. And so their experience of physical space was very different from people who were living in the city. And they were working these night shifts, about a mile and a half, 30 or 40 minute, a 30-minute walk from the factories where they were working. So their experience of space was of extreme isolation. They didn't have cars, and they talked about having to walk at night back and forth from where they were living to their place of work. And their experience, both sets of people, that is, in both sets of interviews, in the interview with 3 machinists and then with the single machinist whose interview I read out to you, they talked about being stopped by the police and questioned about what they were doing, and said that for them was a moment of extreme discomfort. So I would say by and large, immigrants who live in the city and who live outside the workplace in the city have much more mobility and an ability to actually create their own experience of the city, create their city, a city that they live in on their own terms. And if they were live-in caregivers, or if they were working some distance from the city, they were extremely isolated, I would say.
I don't know if it's working. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's working. The Mary, the worker, when you interviewed her, when the other person interviewed her for the second time, she seemed more cool and composed, like you said. And when she was opening up to you, it was more raw.
Yes.
Do you want to change the way you conduct interviews and just keep it to the raw stage, or do you want to take out the second stage? Because the first one was more truthful, it was more innocent and raw, and that presents a better picture than being interviewed for the second time when you know that there's an audience in front of you. Because when you know that there's a public in front of you, like even, take for example, even Facebook, what you project on it and what is actually the picture, there's a difference. So even the way you conduct an interview, do you want to keep it to the first stage itself because that's more true, or do you want to?
I wouldn't say that that's more true. I think they're both different ways of narrating this experience. And she had clearly told this story many times. I mean, I was a bit confused about some of the details because this is really my stupidity. I couldn't get into my head that her employers had called the police when they had stolen stuff from her. And she said that this was something that her lawyer was confused about too. So she had obviously rehearsed it many times. Okay, so what is different is that she was now not presenting it to her lawyer. She was presenting it to us, whom she saw as allies who were connected to the Immigrant Workers Center, and were sort of organizing immigrant workers, and were trying to basically record their experiences and share their experiences. So it was a fairly kind of relaxed context in a way, and also it was in her home. I wouldn't say that it's more genuine or authentic or raw, though.
Just raw. Raw. That's the most appropriate word, I think.
I mean, what I think I might do in retrospect is have people interview each other without our script, because I think that our script really changed the character of the interview. The reason for it was that we were also aiming for efficiency. I mean, and this is problematic. We wanted 15-minute podcasts to put on the website. So that meant that they were they're less digressive, except when she starts talking about the police, when she sees a police car, and that sets off memories, right? They were sticking to a script partly with the aim of presenting a story in a finite amount of time to a broader audience.
You had done a couple of interviews with domestic workers in Bangalore.
Uh-huh.
And you know that overwhelmed by a lot of different factors. And while the factors are different here, one thing that's similar, I think, with Betty was this really personal nature of the relationship between employers.
Yes.
And in the accounts that, in the narrative that I was trying to do in the narrative that we got, there was a constant confliction or oscillation between defending this employer and also talking about his treatment of his confinement in him. And so I was wondering whether you came across that sense of a oscillation or confliction and how do you
I wouldn't say that there was a strong, I didn't hear people defending the employer. Yeah.
By defense, I mean, so it would oscillate between, because caste was separately grown in India. I get food on a separate day, I get treated like this, I get leftover, but she's a good lady. So,
Okay.
I mean, I came across a lot of that.
Yeah. I didn't hear much of that, to be perfectly honest. What I did hear, so for example, in the second interview with the person who was shuttling back and forth, I heard complaints. I mean, so for example, the first interview, there was really a sense of outrage and an extreme sort of anger towards the employer. The second interview was more dispassionate in the sense that she described the conditions of the work and how inconvenient and difficult it was for her. And presented this as a consequence of the circumstances that her employers were in. They were dual citizens, and so they kept shuttling back and forth between the US and Canada, which meant she had to shuttle with them. She talked then about how difficult this made her job without being overtly critical of them. I did a lot of interviews. Okay, so, and this was many years ago. It was, over 10 years ago. I worked with an organization. I was a volunteer in an organization in New York, Saki for South Asian Women. And it's complicated, and people have written about this, but a domestic workers group formed within that organization and then eventually split off from it and formed two other organizations. I was at the point when at the point when the split off happened. And so I interviewed maybe 7 or 8 women working in New York as domestic workers. And again, I would say that there was not a strong sense of identification with the families that they were working for. Often people articulated quite the opposite. That is a sense of downward mobility and a sense of outrage at being treated. I remember one woman, and this is, I did this a long time ago, so the interviews are not fresh in my mind, but one woman talked about how she was made to, told, you can just lie down there on the floor over there, you can sleep there, and this was clearly very offensive to her. She was clearly middle class and had come to the US and had family in the US, but had sort of fallen into a situation where she was then forced to look for domestic work. Also, I would say that it makes a difference that the people I interviewed were people who had already become politically conscious, were, being organized. By the new organization that formed was called Andolan, and it exists even now, and were, talking about their experiences with, a clear sense of their agency. What they were much more, what I did find was sort of much more contradictory, paradoxical, ambiguous in their narratives. I would ask them, so, given how difficult your lives are you glad that you're here? And, do you want to stay here? And at that point, what was interesting was they said that yes, they were, because they had in fact become far more independent. Again, going back to the city, were much more able to navigate the city, to find employment on terms that were acceptable to them, to earn, and that they did not want to go back. Okay, so yeah.
I just wanted to thank you actually for a very interesting connection between district and tourism. I was thinking a lot about Butler's work on precarity, and I feel it should introduce of precariousness and precarity as performances of citizenship and the right to life as right. In some sense. So I was wondering how this podcast and just being able to have a sensitivity to do all of this allows for the performance of citizenship that transcends especially even the neoliberal nature of citizenship.
Right. Yeah. I haven't thought about it, and I don't know this particular work by this is Judith Butler? Yeah.
I mean, the current work is on precarity.
Okay, so I should look at this. But one thing I would say that this is a sort of, clearly a kind of a critique of neoliberal and mainstream discourses of citizenship, obviously, and it gives the lie to, public, a kind of public self-image of Canada, a very common one, as liberal, open to immigrants, as less exploitative than, say, the US, which isn't borne out by people's experiences. So in a way, it's a kind of it's a claim to citizenship, to full citizenship, and essentially, I would say a critique of the very limited, and that's why the whole history of citizenship is important, and the history of migration, the limitations on full citizenship that what in Canada are called visible minorities and new immigrants experience. So it gives the lie, in a sense, to this mythology of citizenship. But what also becomes clear is that there is a kind of global sense of citizenship as well, right? Of precarity, in that one can never locate oneself stably in one place. One has to move from place to place. But also a sense of a kind of commonality of experience and a kind of a knowledge and familiarity with global narratives that comes across in these interviews, I would say. So citizenship that is on the one hand sort of marginal in Canada, and which critiques notions of citizenship as they are proclaimed by sort of neoliberal politicians, but also a citizenship that's global, but also a kind of citizenship that is a sort of an experience of cosmopolitanism from below, vernacular cosmopolitanism. So what is the piece by Butler? I should look at it.
Well, there are a couple of different pieces she's working currently on. I can send you stuff.
Yeah,
actually.
that would be great.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's, of course, Arendt's work on citizenship.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I can definitely send you the.
Yeah. Okay.
stuff.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Hoping, we'll be able to see a lot more of you at, a lot more of the IIHS talks. We do these quite regularly. So if any of you want to get onto our mailing list, let us know. But yeah, we look forward to seeing you all here again soon. And thank you again for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.